My name is Paul Cho. I have the honor of serving at Tucson First United Methodist Church. And I want to thank all of you for joining in our panel discussion today. It is wonderful to know that so many of you have this desire to learn and grow with us. I thought that I would open with a word of prayer before I turn our attention over to Javier Olivares, who is the co-chair of our DSC-Race Coalition. So if you will, please join me in an attitude of prayer. O loving God, we see such your beautiful works evident in all of our lives, and we see that you have planned and prepared for us such an evening that it might shake us and awaken us to see you in each other. We ask for your spirit to be with all of us, that we would be joined with you and with one another in our learning, in our growing, in our sharing, even in our pain, that we might be the body of Christ for one another and for this world. Be with us and all of our speakers and all who are participating. This we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Reverend Javier Olivares.
Thank you, Reverend Paul Cho. Good evening, and thank you for joining us at this time. As Reverend Paul said, I'm the co-chair along with my colleague, Reverend Khalif Smith, of the Race Coalition. And RACE stands for Reflection, Action, Courageous Dialogue, and Engagement. And for the coalition, it is essential that to have a critical dialogue where not only, for example, Latinos are fighting for justice just for their own, or Blacks are fighting for equality just for them without any allies, or Asians or Pacific Islanders are also fighting just themselves, but fighting for equality and justice. But to have that dialogue of how can we be better allies, how can we support each other, how can we learn from each other, and how can we all be in that dialogue and in that fight for justice and equity and equality for everyone, and not only people that look like us or like our culture or our ethnicity. And so that is one of the statements of the coalition of how can we become better allies, and how can we use that intersectionality to grow each of us. And so with that said, I would like to introduce our first set of speakers. And as one of them you already met, Reverend Paul Cho, senior pastor of Tucson, First United Methodist Church in Tucson. I'm sorry, I got some sweat in my eyes. I don't know what. Paul didn't make me cry, so no worries. Reverend Paul Cho of First United Methodist Church in Tucson. We also have Julie O'Neill, who is a layperson from Dayspring United Methodist Church in Tempe, Arizona. And we also have Pastor Christopher Werps, who is an associate pastor, the associate pastor of modern worship and discipleship of Paradise Valley United Methodist Church. So I leave it with Reverend Christopher Werps.
Hey, good evening, everyone. And I've been asked to introduce our moderator for the evening, Julie O'Neill, a little bit more fully. And so I'd like to introduce our moderator, Julie O'Neill. Julie is a member of the DSC-Race Coalition and has been since its inception last year. And she, as Javier said, attends Dayspring United Methodist Church as a lay member. Julie carries a deep love not only for issues around justice and reconciliation, but also helping to bring the United Methodist Church into a more inclusive and generous future. Julie's been a primary leader in organizing the DSC-Race Coalition's efforts around Asian Pacific Islander Month. And I know I'm looking forward to seeing her lead this conversation in her leadership this evening. So please join me in welcoming Julie to as she helps to get things started.
Thanks, everyone. It is such a joy to be here. And this has been exciting work that not only the DSC-Race Coalition has been exploring and been a part of, but also the subgroup of Christopher and Paul and I. We've really had some great energy and excitement and some fun working on the 3 different projects for this AAPI month. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and introduce our panelists for tonight who will be sharing with us. We have a variety of folks who have joined us. The first one is Mr. Minwoo Ahn. Oops, sorry, just a second. He is a layperson at First United Methodist Church in Tucson. He's an international graduate student at the University of Arizona, focusing on public policy and management, especially around environmental and energy issues. Next, we have Jungrea Chung. She is a retired elder of the Greater New Jersey Annual Conference. She has been a Korean translator at the Desert Southwest Conference here since 2017. And so it's been a great joy to have her in our midst. She has been active at Henderson United Methodist Church in Henderson, Nevada, and is also doing some pulpit supply at Boulder City United Methodist Church in Boulder City, Nevada. We also have Pastor Diamond Pate, who is hopefully soon to be a commissioned elder in our conference. Diamond serves at First United Methodist Church of Gilbert and is also a member of our DSC-Race Coalition. We have the joy of having Reverend Timote Piukala, who is also an elder in the Desert Southwest Conference, who graduated from Claremont School of Theology a few years ago. And he serves at Tongan United Methodist Church in Mesa, Arizona, and is also a member of the DSC-Race Coalition. We have Reverend Anthony Tang, an elder in the Desert Southwest Conference, who is serving at Desert Mission United Methodist Church in Scottsdale. Anthony is a Chinese American, and his family has been in the state of Arizona since 1920. And last but not least, we have Reverend Efrain Zavala, who is a provisional elder serving at Prescott United Methodist Church in Prescott, Arizona. And he is also a member of the DSC-Race Coalition. So as we continue, it's been such a joy to have a conversation about what's important for you all as the Desert Southwest Conference to know about the AAPI experience. You all may or may not be familiar with that category. It stands for Asian American Pacific Islander. And I want to say a caveat though, because there's also the term of APA, Asian Pacific American, or Pacifica. And the caveat is that, you know, anytime you get a group of folks together, to lump them all together in one term is such a disservice. And so we recognize that the AAPI or APA or Pacifica terms encompass people from over 30 different countries. So on some level, it is such a disservice to minimize the different cultures, the backgrounds, the experiences of all sorts of wonderful people into such limited terms. And so first, before we start, we recognize that. We also recognize that the voices on this panel that you'll hear from tonight represent some great perspectives, but there's also so many more perspectives out there. I had a conversation with one of our panelists, and even just saying, you know, I'm Korean, and somebody else who's Korean may have two completely different experiences, how we grew up, what our family structure looks like. And that's just between two Korean people, let alone anyone else from these 30 countries. So we recognize in some ways how, while this panel and this conversation is important, how it does fall short in capturing the nuances of experience, of background, of history, of culture that is so vibrant in these communities. So bear with us, give us some grace. We're excited that we have this conversation started. It's the first time in our Desert Southwest Conference that we are recognizing in such a prominent way AAPI month. So we hope that this will be the kickoff to more activities, perhaps around the month of May, but also having conversations with those who identify as AAPIs in our conference to have some times of solidarity, times of building community. So please know that we are aware of the limitations of this, but we're also very grateful and joyful for being able to share our experiences in this time with you. So I would invite our panelists who will enter into our first time of sharing to turn on your video. Tonight's conversation is going to be in 3 different parts. This first part is just a time of hearing from our panelists some experiences that they've had, personal experiences they've had with being a member of the AAPI community, issues of encountering racism in their personal lives, perhaps at the grocery store, perhaps at church. So I would invite in this first segment, any of our panelists who feels compelled to go ahead and start.
Maybe I will start. Okay, I will try to make it short. I was in seminary in 1977, which is a long time ago, in Ohio Methodist Theological School, which is one of the Methodist denominational seminaries. After that time, the ordination process is quite different, quite different compared to now. But I experienced that the racism as a female seminary students, it was very a sad experience when we went into the process of going into the district level. My interview was turned down. The reason is my paper was submitted one day later. But one of my seminarian, who submitted one day later than I am, because she told me she got accepted and I'm not. So that time that somehow it was known, so I had to appear again, and I have to share that name of my friend and ask the checking that date. And that time they said, I'm sorry, you are right. So I got into that. That is my first encounter of how even in the denomination, even in the church, is differently approached depending on the race. So anyway, that is the very sad, but as I reflect now, in the beginning, I was very upset, very angry, and sad most of all, it's sad. And I said, I don't want to go into this ministry anymore. It's not God called me, but it's not, maybe I'm wrong. That kind of the struggle. But as I get older and reflect on, and also there are so many clergy women of AAPI, as well as the number-wise, we have a lot of numbers. Not Desert Southwest, we have good numbers, but across the nation, in our denomination, we have large numbers coming up. And I'm so happy, but still there are some remaining things, there's some, but that is one of my experience. But I'm glad that our denomination moves forward, and each individual, the understanding, as Julie mentioned, that cultural difference and narrowness or the limited experience or exposure to another culture made that kind of the limited perspective. So as I get older, I think I get more wisdom. So kind of forgiveness or acceptance to take all whatever you say, okay. And then I'm trying to step into their own beat to look at why that person is looking at that way, why that institution is looking at that, and dig into the past and their history, then it's understandable. But we have to challenge in my personalities instead of aggressively. I am more like a very kind of passive way of the approach. Each person is different, but that is who I am now.
I'll share my experience. One of the challenges that I've had throughout my life, just from being even a young child, there was, when I didn't understand it, growing up in Arizona, there was this constant sense of being on the receiving end of this communication that I didn't belong. I wasn't like others, and I didn't have a place here. And now, as I grew up, I struggled with that, but where it really began to develop turned out to be in some of the more liberal places that I was in. So when I was in, it wasn't seminary, but it's not limited for me to the denomination. It's really been most places that I've gone. This sense of the question, where are you from? Where are you from? And I respond, I'm from Arizona. No, you don't understand me. Where are you from? As if I didn't understand the question. But the number of people that would just walk up to me speaking, non-Vietnamese people speaking to me in Vietnamese, non-Japanese people speaking Japanese to me, non-Chinese people speaking Chinese to me. And it took me a long time to understand, because over the years, it just built into this increasing frustration where I admit there were times when I would just blow because I was so frustrated. And recently I heard the term perpetual foreigner or exotic foreigner. And this idea that, well-intentioned people thinking that they're bridging bridges by speaking to me or trying to speak my language or show interest in who I am, what they don't realize is that by maintaining this idea of that an Asian person or Asian American person is a perpetual foreigner or somehow exotic, that the message I receive over and over and over, and most recently happened in the grocery store, is that this message of, you don't belong here. You don't belong. Probably the one time that was most frustrating to me, I was in line in a cafeteria at school, And I'm just trying to get my food, and the person behind me starts speaking Polish with the person working behind the counter. So they had this Polish conversation going back and forth, and I didn't think anything much of it. But then I went down, took my food, sat down at the table. We all kind of sat at this table, and the person across said, "Wow, what were you speaking?" And he says, "I was speaking Polish." "How do you know Polish?" And he says, "Well, I'm Polish." So I flipped out with this idea that if you're white, clearly you belong. You belong here. Doesn't matter if you are a recent immigrant or here for 200 years, you belong. And if you are Asian or Pacific Islander, you perpetually do not belong. You don't have a place here, and you're fascinating because you're exotic. And, you know, embarrassingly, I admit, you know, whenever people ask me for an introduction, or if I'm in a general group, I did this with Julie, as you asked, you know, for a brief introduction. I say, my name's Anthony, yada, yada. You know, my family's been in Arizona since 1920. And I do that, which I know it's problematic in its own for me to say that racially, but I get so tired of being told I don't belong. It's become a part of my introduction to say, this is my home, this is where I'm from. I'm from Arizona. And so I admit I continue to struggle with that, and struggle with how I can have a reasonable response when I hear that question so often.
I'd like to take this opportunity to share with you some personal experience. And well, the first time I consciously encountered racism, and I say consciously, and I'll address that a little later, is I was fortunate enough to receive a scholarship to a small-time school in West Virginia. And when I was playing football up there, I'd happened to take the position of a white player that previously held that position. So the position was offered to me, also came along with the playing time. And I encountered these players after hours, after school, in a different venue. And one of them approached me and said, "You do that again, boy, we'll kill you, you island nigger." It's been almost 21 years since that day. And that continues to play in my mind over and over and over again. I said earlier about being conscious about racism. That was the first time that it hit me like a ton of bricks right into my face. And it was no longer just a myth or another ethnicity's problem. It was something bigger than what I could understand. My father is Tongan and my mother is white. And as I sit back and reflect on my life, my grandmother, my mother's mother, my grandmother, she would scrub my skin with a foot scrubber because my skin was too dark. And she would tell me this. So I encountered racism unconsciously at that time to understand what was happening to me. But as I sit back and reflect on it, and you constantly, it lives with you. Those situations live with you, and you feel that you're not living up to a certain standard. And the frustrating thing about that is it sets limitations on yourself that are so unfair, because you're living up to someone else's unfair expectations of you. I can feel what my brother Anthony was saying. There's a lot of times when people will approach you and they don't understand the Pacific Island culture, but they find the need to explain their vacation to you. You know, it's a wonderful time when you go on a vacation to Hawaii, and which is fine, but a lot of those instances, it's more commercialized and a lot of times far away from the actual culture that's being presented. And people often find time to stop me and explain their anniversary or their vacation that they had. And, you know, I find it hard to connect other than the fact that they had a good time. But, you know, it's these instances where people mean well and they want to share, but, you know, and I often sit back and reflect on those times. And I think Julie and those who have put this together, this is the first time that I've been able to say this out in front of anyone other than, you know, my wife who had passed away and my closest. This is and so forgive me. This is something that I've buried deep in my mind. I've tried to forget. This is the first time that I've uttered this experience in front of anyone. So thank you for listening.
So I think compared to other panel members here, I think I have a relatively short period of time, you know, here in the US. I first came here as a graduate student here. So I did not grow up in America. I grew up in South Korea and I came here. So the biggest thing was my home country is by and large a very monolithic country. And I was, you know, aware that America is such a diverse country that you have to understand the American social fabric. So, you know, my approach was, you know, just get to know people in you know, faculty members or graduate students, undergraduate students in the school. And so I started to engage with them. And I think the way I experience maybe some of the unintended racism is that I experience a lot of shunning and isolation. So one thing I start to realize that, you know, when you go to restaurants or bar, you know, majority of people in your environment is, you know, in higher education is white people, right? And so one thing I realized is that people don't want to talk with me, or people don't look at my eyes. They just talk about things, each other, but they never give a chance to talk about things. So, so I think it's not only my experience, but a lot of other students. And I think students are really important because I think a lot of first generations, especially Asian Americans, actually came here as international students like me, and they decided to stay here as a naturalized citizen in the US. But as you experience these kinds of shunning, and as you see sort of the leaders in your organization, there's no Asians or Pacific Islanders at all. So you realize that, oh, my voice is not likely to be heard by anyone. So, you know, I think a lot of, especially I think Asian students are, you know, start to shutting down, and or they could be in a cycle that they are less engaged because they're not taken seriously, and, you know, sort of this vicious cycle is coming to many, I think, especially the Asian students. So and, you know, I know that a lot of my friends, you know, and they don't necessarily intend to do some racial things, but, you know, there's a lot of the things that I realize that they don't know how to talk with me. They don't know I mean, obviously they don't want to be racist. So they are sort of taking an approach that is very safe. So they don't really engage with me because they want to be in safe. They want to be right. I don't want to be a racist. So that puts in them in sort of a the situation that they are not engaged much with I think Asian international students. So
thanks, everyone. I just had a moment of trying to balance being a moderator, but also wanting to share as part of this panel. So if you would allow me the opportunity, many of you may know that I'm a transracial, national adoptee. So I was adopted into a white family, with white parents. It's a biracial family. I very much grew up in a culture of white privilege. Here in Phoenix, some similarities to Anthony's story of, you know, saying my family has been here for generations, the complexity of that as well. And so even within my family, though, there was a certain amount of safety. My parents were always very open and honest that the three of my siblings, myself and two others, were adopted, and then my parents had my sister biologically. And so they were always very open about that. And almost to the fact that we didn't understand that that could be different in other places, that could mean something different. So the safe place, if you will, was in our family. And then when we would go out to the outside world, that's when it was a little different. We received messages that weren't about safety, that weren't about, you know, this being normal, a normal family, if you will. And I very much echo some of what's been said about sort of that imposter syndrome, right? So like very much growing up in a culture of white privilege, of being sometimes seen as white in some ways, having advantages that some white people have, but yet not being white. And so sort of that dualism of not being in a safe culture in whiteness, if you will, but also not fully identifying with my Asian heritage, with Asian cultures, with Asian foods. And so I think for me, I have struggled with feeling like I'm an imposter in two worlds, not totally fitting in. I think, you know, I also recognize the fact that I have privilege with a white sounding name. When I would apply to schools or when I would apply for scholarships, people would see my name and then they would sometimes see my face, and there would be a look, if you will, of wait, you know, you know, and so that time it took to register. Some of the challenges I think with that are, you know, the invalidation or the painful part of not being fully something, if you will. And so you know, one of the things that I am aware of growing up as an Asian female, probably like many of you, having microaggressions, you know, we could kind of go down the list of ones like Anthony has said about where are you from and different things like that. But one that I'm very, very aware of is about body image, and especially female Asians, Koreans. And I bring this up because I think it has parallels between, you know, the fetishization, the sexualization of Asian women, and how on the one hand, you know, that might be a little bit awkward of a topic. On the one hand, it's inappropriate comments that I've been told by people that I've had romantic relationships with. But it's also, it plays out in ways like, oh, you're so short and you're petite and how cute and how tiny. And all of that feeds into that culture of sexualizing Asian women, to where then those comments turn into acts of violence. And things like what happened in Atlanta a couple of weeks ago, and where dominant culture men can say, oh, I just have a sex addiction. And so I cannot erase myself from that narrative of being characterized in some of those ways, and what society, what culture says, right? And so I think that that's also part of this conversation of how we respond to things that are said to us. We've shared some very personal, very painful things. I think there's also a place where those things happen, not just out there in the world, but they also happen in our churches. And so I want to shift us a little bit to the second topic that we're going to start talking about tonight, and looking at where we have experienced prejudice or bias or racist acts or racist words or sayings in our churches, right? Because I think that that's a reality that we face, is that it's not that just happens out there. It happens in our churches too, if we're completely honest. And so I just want to invite any of our panelists. What would you like to share about
that? I can jump in. You know, in some ways, I think I've been pretty privileged as far as the churches that I've been sent to. My churches have been very generous and gracious with me. I think at each, I believe at each church I've been to as a sole or senior pastor, I've kind of heard the side comments of, well, so-and-so's no longer here since we heard about the new pastor coming. So I think there's been, I think a few people have left each church before I've arrived. And frankly, I've been just fine with that. Leave before I arrive is fine with me. But where I think I've seen more frustrating parts of the racism in the church is really coming through, not so much the local church for me, but in our denomination, and the sense of tokenism, and which is, I think everybody struggles trying to figure out the difference between tokenism and representation. Part of the hard part is that I guess I would define tokenism as wanting to have somebody present so that we can check off a box, or to say we're a diverse group, or we're open to everyone's voice. But where it becomes not representation, but tokenism, is when we are wanted to check that box, but our voice is not really welcomed, or where we're put on there not because of our qualifications, but because we've checked that box. And in some ways it was good for me, because it taught me early on that I had to say no, as people kept wanting me to join different task force and groups and organizations. So I had to learn how to say no to that. But, and I will admit that I have gained from that. There's a sense of privilege that comes with it, because I have been put into opportunities that I might not have gotten had I looked like everyone else. So it's a complicated matter. But I generally reject the idea that we should be putting on people onto groups just because we fill those boxes, or just because because none of us can speak for the entire group. None of us can speak for all Asians are all Pacific Islanders or Asian Americans. We can't speak for everyone. And really, can we focus on qualifications and abilities, but also I think we don't want to be excluded just because we're of a different color than the dominant group. I'm still trying to make my way through those complexities, but it's difficult.
Thank you. Where I find myself in our conference, it's a bit challenging. I find myself at a time where I'm the only ordained elder of Pacific Island descent in all of our annual conference, being the only Tongan. But where I see the difficulties that we, at least for the Tongans and the Pacific Islanders, and that I see in our conference, is that a lot of times we're sacrificing the opportunity to raise leaders in the name of being multicultural. Now, being multicultural is a wonderful thing, but I also believe that as Asian and Pacific Islanders, we have a unique experience that we bring as individuals culturally to the conference. And I also think that it's important that we offer opportunities for Pacific Islanders and Asians to worship in a way that helps elevate that culture and bring and enhance and bring those to the table. But what I find is a lot of times these ministries are turned into just language ministries, and just I feel that there needs to be more opportunity for our culture to be recognized and offered an equal seat at the table. So I share this with you. A few years ago, we were, I worked with you, Anthony, at a time when we were able to share our culture at annual conference. And it was a wonderful opportunity to showcase our traditional outfits and our music. And the conversation that we had was to share our culture with the conference. And it was a wonderful experience. And I thank you for opening up that opportunity. And I'll never forget the conversation that we had. And they said, this isn't just for a spectacle or halftime show. This is an opportunity for you to showcase the beauty of your culture with the conference. And that's exactly where I think these conversations are vital, that our cultures are just not the halftime show or just the exotic feature and things that are happening in our conference, but we have something to offer when we come together to the table.
Yeah, I really appreciate what Anthony, you mentioned right now about that, the cultural exposure. As I listen and also as I look at all the questions we are going to deal with it, I remind myself that my experience in 1980, when I took the one course, it's a course ethnic minority issues in the United States at the American University in Washington, D.C. That course has the Native Americans, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans. It's a history as well as the current situation at that time. It was, and then we also field trip. It's a part of it. So we went to the Native American Bureau, which I never knew about that existing. So many different nations within the Native Americans, and the sufferings and pains, which is like death march, all kinds of the sufferings Native Americans went through, and Hispanic Americans through the Mexican American War, all these backgrounds, as well as Asian Americans from Chinese and Japanese, and all these history until the 1968, when the immigration law was changed, and then still permeates the racism and prejudice in American society. As well, and these kind of the four ethnic groups learning really helped me. Just a minute, let me turn off this one. Helped me to really grab who I am and how I connect with other ethnics. Maybe that's why my concern is more ethnic ministries, because it's unique. Each ethnic is unique. Even in Asia, we have how many countries within in Asia and the Pacific, AAPI? We have so many. And when I even visit Tonga, and the Tonga Methodist Church is such an amazing, it's a rich history with the community, and their way of worship, their way of life makes me to ponder, wow, this is totally which I didn't understand. So one of the things I keep saying, it really gave me authentic way of for me who I am. I'm not perfect. I'm not, my English is a secondary language, so I'm still struggling, but yet, is there anything I can contribute? So that's why my focus was to help. As a Korean, I try to help the Korean Americans, particularly laity, who do worship in the Korean language setting, but they don't know, communicate with other people. They are really confined in the Korean congregation. I try to open that door for them to expose to other cultures as much as they can through my way of support. So maybe that's why it's my secondary job. It's not job. I just took time and tried to help our people, Korean Americans, who open the door and communicate in mission as well as in ministries. So as I listen and as I prepare what kind of things we need to do, I just wonder, education and exposure is the key for our desert Southwest, particularly those ethnic groups are very small in number. How we help them, kind of the special school opening, even on 9 June or something, so that open the doors. Like Native Americans, we have so many here in this area, and then it will help us to go. The Tongan group, even within our Asia AAPI, people don't know where the Tonga is located, even that kind of stuff. So I think within us, particularly, this is small numbers, but if we are able to, particularly through this RACE group, to make a launch like program and to try to help others through, and God give us, we are here, no matter you and I, we are here in this area. I think there is a meaning, the purpose of life, to share our stories so that break that barrier or open the door a little, like wide open, so they can see the others. Oh, there is something. Because the racism and prejudice, in my view, my experience tells me that if people do not have experience and exposure, they are closed-minded. But once they open, it's better for them to see the other window, through other windows. So that is what I think we might be able to overcome a little bit, not much, but yet there is a chance and opportunity. This is what I'm thinking right now. Thank you.
I definitely resonate with what Jungrea Chung has said. I think exposure and experience is really important. I think especially for people like me or first generations or international students who came to the country and the new church. So Timothy and Anthony definitely have much longer history in the church, but as I look back, my experience at the UMC in Tucson, UMC Tucson was really warm, and I didn't experience any kinds of racism in both Korean congregation and the American congregation. But I have two messages maybe that can help audience when you encounter these kind of issues. As I mentioned, I think the first thing that a lot of AAPI members who came to the country for the first time experiences a lot of isolations and shunning. So, and a lot of times I feel like people don't listen to me. People are not really patient about my language. Obviously people have language issues, language barriers, that's a huge issue for, I think, Koreans or any ethnic groups from very different culture. But a lot of times people are impatient about what I'm saying to them. So they they're scrambling to finish the conversation or conversation is going awkward. So what I can say is, the other point is that in many public speaking setting in the church and the school, the stereotypes about Asians are shy. I would say that's completely wrong. Asians are not shy, and that's American stereotypes of Asians. And people express emotions and opinions in very different ways. So you have to provide different ways to process those voices. So for instance, some people might be more comfortable in one-on-one instead of a public speaking setting, or some people will be more comfortable with the indirect conversation. So you should not assume that this person is shy or Asian shy. And you have to provide different ways of communicating when you have issues. And the other thing is, I think improving the digital literacy is really important. So we have very new media environment these days. So you can easily, and a lot of people say that, American mainstream media has portrayed Asians or Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, in a stereotypical way. But I think because of the new media environment, you can really expose yourself in a real people's lives. And so you have to be balancing those, and you have to get your information from multiple sources. So that's very helpful, and you can do easily. And most of all, I think my final point is that just spend time with your AAPI friends. Instead of learning through media, mainstream media, or other kinds of media, just listen AAPI friends and spending time with them and just hanging out with them more, and try to understand their very different kinds of background. As Julie mentioned before, I grew up in Korea. I mean, Julie is Korean, but Julie is a Korean adoptee. I'm an international student. Paul is 1.5 generation. So we have very different walks of life. So you have to be careful, and you really want to understand sort of that person's background more carefully. Thank you.
Yeah, I echo a lot of what's been said. I think that what I've encountered in the church is when I've shared different situations or challenges that I've encountered that involve race or involve somebody wanting me to participate only on World Communion Sunday because I would look nice up front, right? I think to me, some of the well-intendedness of good Christian people, I think can actually do some harm. You know, I think when people say, well, they didn't mean it that way. When they say, can't we just, you know, can't you just forget about it? Can't we just be Christian and love each other? And so that's where I sometimes wrestle is, yes, we can. And that also means unpacking these things, talking about them in honest ways, acknowledging the pain and the harm that sometimes happens, and then how to work toward true reconciliation toward that. I see some questions in the chat, and I would invite Paul, who's going to lead us in a time of Q&A.
Yeah, so for those of you who were not able to see the chat message that I had presented, you are welcome to submit questions via chat. I am able to see the questions, and then I will attempt to make the question available for us. I cannot guarantee that we will get to all of the questions, but one that I have, one that I came and want to ask our panelists has to deal with the topic of unity, but the challenges of talking about Christian unity, not in the sense of creating a homogeneous kind of a setting, but one that is respectful of our cultures and boundaries, and yet knowing that there's an overlap there. What is your sense and your sense of Christian unity and how we can do that in a respectful manner in the church in regards to how we can all contribute to the same life of the Christian life?
Do you mind if I jump in on this one? I would say, you know, I'll be honest. Everything that I've talked against, I've also participated in. So I don't think anyone is really free from racism. And I don't want to give that perspective that, oh, I have it together. I mean, I admit I have othered others and unintentionally communicated to other people that they don't belong here. And I've had to learn from those. And, you know, one of them is when I had an opportunity of working with First Filipino up in Las Vegas. Was such an amazing congregation and wonderful people, and they taught me a lot. And one of the challenges I had is that I wanted, for a Filipino congregation, I wanted to clump them all together as this one culture from this one country. And the conversations that I learned from were amazing. They communicated with me. They said, Pastor, when you hear us yelling, Tagalog, Tagalog, that's because a pair of people are speaking in their local dialect and the rest of us are excluded because we don't speak that dialect. And so we're asking them to speak in our language. And there was so much diversity within their own church. And, you know, it was a strong reminder to me that I have to be aware of, you know, trying to actively not group people as having the same experience. And, you know, how do we create a sense of unity as Christians? And I don't think unity is about all of us either being the same or expected to be the same, but how do we create space for each other? As Minwoo mentioned, you know, how do we listen and be aware of individual people's experiences, and then to take it beyond listening, you know, are there different practices, or what does Christianity mean? Or how do we express our faith in different ways? And can we incorporate that not just on one day out of the year, as Julie mentioned, but just incorporate it because, you know, it's a normal Sunday and so is participating because we're a part of the same church. And we're going to experience a little bit of each other's lives because we're a part of the same church. So I think creating space for that unique experience and really getting to know each other as individuals and taking the time to really battle, because I think all of us in some way or another have it, to battle that desire to make life easy on ourselves by clumping other people together. And when we can challenge ourselves to just be open to the diversity that we have, that's where I think we find that richness.
Thank you, Anthony. I wonder if there are other panelists who wanted to also chime in.
You know what, as I listen to unity, even in one family, the siblings look so different, right? I think it's a kind of the reminding of us as we worship, even within your own family, under the same mother, same father, but that's so different, then it's natural for us to make a different. Only thing is that when we are judgmental, that's the problem. We do not judge your sibling like you are bad or you are better than I am, or, you know, that kind of comparison. So how we, as a laity and clergy, to see that the Christian base in that perspective, that is a constant challenge. But if we are able to remind ourselves that such a difference among even within small family or larger family is church family, it's a natural for us to have a difference. But there is a beauty like a flower garden, so many flowers. If you have a same rose garden, maybe it's pretty because the rose is pretty, but you have a different colors. So how we do this as a church, that is an issue. Constant reminding ourselves who we are as a person of God's creation, as nature itself is. There is nothing same. There is no same thing, even the same name. So this is what we constantly remind ourselves. And then particularly when we are judged, racism comes out of our judgmental view. And then, or superiority, inferiority, that kind of the comparison. So that has to be, I think as a conference, our group, maybe challenge our church leadership as well as local churches to see that. And our presentation, being here and there, and also, even though we are hurt inside, but yet we are there as a means for them to open their hearts and minds. Maybe this is what I think. Okay.
Thank you, Reverend Chung. I am seeing that our attendees are submitting more questions. I feel that we might move to the third topic. We will have another Q&A, and I will try to summarize more of these questions along with the additional questions that you may prepare for this third topic. But Julie, back to you.
All right, so this last segment, I would like to invite the members on the panel who will be joining us from the DSC-Race Coalition, Pastor Diamond and Reverend Efrain. And I think part of the challenge of that Javier mentioned at the beginning is that we all are supposed to be allies, right? So Asians aren't just supposed to advocate for Asians in Asian Pacific Islander Month, right? Black people aren't just Black during Black History Month. And so I think, and that's a conversation that we've had in our race coalition about how to have cross-cultural dialogue and the importance of recognizing that our lives are intersectional. We can't just focus on justice for one group of marginalized people without being able to focus on everyone. So that's why Efrain and Diamond are here to help enhance the conversation. So this next part is talking a little bit about the importance of cross-cultural dialogue and what it means to be an ally. So I would invite whomever would like to chime in.
Yeah, thank you, Julie, for inviting us to speak, and thank you all to the other panelists for sharing your stories. And thank you for all your hard work for the things you put together for this month. We thought it was really important as a race coalition to invite you all to share in the resources this month, because one thing that I think is really, really important, one thing I had a college professor really chime into us is like, no one is voiceless. Like the whole idea of, I want to be a voice for the voiceless. No one is voiceless. And so often as people of color, people want to speak for us when we have our own voices, and people want to represent us when we should also be able to represent ourselves as well. And so we thought it was important to make room and make space for our AAPI siblings to make this month something that they could use as an opportunity to share. And so as as a person of color, I thought it was important to talk about ways that we're called to be siblings. Like I take very seriously that call to be body of Christ, and as one part of our body is hurting, we're all hurting, that we shouldn't be siloed together. Just because right now we're calling for justice for our AAPI sibling doesn't mean that we're not also calling for justice for our Black siblings or for our Latinx siblings. Like we're all working together and journeying together, and so that's what it means to have that cultural dialogue, and to have true relationships. So not just talking about a person group, but actually being with that person group. So I really appreciated what Minwoo was saying, and he was sharing examples of how to be a good ally. And I think that's exactly bringing home that point where again, no one is voiceless. Like hear from the groups themselves how to be a good ally, instead of just assuming like, oh, this is how I can be a good ally, I know better. Asking the groups themselves, how can I help you? And listening, I think, is number one key.
Hi, everyone. I have to confess that I didn't have much of an opportunity to engage people in meaningful dialogue, people who were different from me racially, ethnically, until later in my life. And one of the most valuable experiences for me was going to seminary. The seminary I attended has a big Korean community, right? And it was such a wonderful thing to, one of my favorite memories was having a conversation with one of them. And, I told him I'm Mexican, I was born in Mexico. And he said, oh, Chicharito, he said. And Chicharito is a very famous Mexican soccer player. And I thought, this is so great. I mean, just the fact that we can connect in that way. I mean, English was the second language for both of us, but we could communicate that way through our experiences and the things that we liked in common, and that was wonderful. I have found that I've appreciated everyone's comments, and I do think that's important to understand all the time that we can't put everybody of a particular group in a box and say everybody's like this, but we have to be able to engage with people and understand that within every group of people there's going to be differences, and there's going to be a diversity. That's been very important to me as an ally. As I'm trying to engage and connect with people, the first thing that I try to do is learn people's names. And it's such a small thing, right? But if you learn people's names, if you learn to pronounce them, if you're curious and you make that effort, it really does make a difference. It makes a difference for me as a Mexican American, and I know it does for somebody else. And I remember having these conversations with people about their names, and they told me, well, this means this and this, and this. It was such beautiful very thoughtful names. And I thought, wow, this is great. Why don't we have those conversations where even small things like that, paying attention to people, and trying to meet people where they are, little things like in my experience, I mean, I realized that my Korean friends would sometimes hand things over with both hands, or be very respectful and things like that. And there were certain things that I could connect with in that regard, right? I mean, there's in my own context, you can see those dynamics with people who are perhaps of a certain age, people who come from a different background, and again, same thing. It's not the same for everybody, but when we find those things that we have in common, and learn to value those, and even when we see those things that are different and learn to appreciate them, we can set some kind of foundation for more dialogue. And it's really the small things that count, just seeing people where they are and taking the time to learn things from them. And that's, it can be, it's a simple thing to do, but it's not always an easy thing to do. And so I think if we take the time to do that, I think it's definitely a good start.
Efrain, thank you for that emphasis on names, because names are, yes, I loved that. Names are so important. And so I just want to reaffirm that especially when a name from our native language, it can be difficult to pronounce, it can be difficult to, like, our muscles are not the same, but to press and practice until we get someone's name right is a powerful expression of inclusion. And for me, I talked earlier about that sense of not belonging and how people communicate. We can not belong through their actions. For me, it means to be an ally is how do we, are you losing me? Sorry. For me, inclusion and being an ally is about how do we communicate to others that do belong, that they belong. And talking a little bit about the intersectionality, there was a time when I was being a little bit snarky, so if you'll me, but a young person was talking to me and they were building pressure and wanting to say this big news. They came out and revealed themselves to be, and my response was, okay, and what's the big news I know it was talking to them, but what I communicated in that moment was, oh, you belong. And it's not, not that you aren't different, you're not an other. So, when it comes to, I think whether a person is Asian or Pacific Islander, Hispanic or Black, or whatever we may be, how do we realize that others belong? And sometimes the more special we make them out to be really indicates that they're an other, that they don't belong. And so to just assume somebody is, of course you're part of the community, of course you're part of this church. When we are wondering about if we're wanting to start a conversation, what I try to remind myself is, would I say this to everyone else here? How do I show interest in somebody else for the person that they are, not for what I perceive them as being different? Even if we take the word prejudice, right? It's built on pre-judging. And what are we prejudging about someone based on how they look? And can we simply approach them and be able to say, hello, I'd like to meet you. I'd love to hear about yourself, and not try to extract some special information that we want to get from them, where they were born or what their ethnicity is, but how do we let them answer the question and we go with their answer and just follow because we're interested in them as a human being, as a person, as a unique individual. And for me, that creates welcome and hospitality.
One of the things within the church, as I look at that, local churches, of course, that the persons who are appointed to the non-native language church, it is one of the ways to expose and let the congregation to understand and embrace it. I think local churches are generally, they are more open-minded. That is my experience. On the denominational level, it is my fortunate opportunities for me to attend the General Conference, not as a delegate, but as a helper for how many times since 1980, almost every quadrennial, every 4 years, I was there and watch the changes or the dynamics of our particularly racial dilemma, racial conflict among the leadership, so-called delegates or who make a decision making for the policy. In the beginning, I noticed that the ethnic groups, whether they are African American, Latino, or Native American. Native Americans, it was the most weakest body, like number-wise, it's a small and very, but their way of saying is such a powerful. At that time, all those small numbers, very small numbers of these, even African American, they all jumped and worked together. It's like a rally together. But I saw the changes as the numbers of African American congregation are stronger in leadership, and Asians also, particularly Korean Americans, we became like a segregated among ourselves instead of teamwork. And I see, it's a really sad thing for me to watch it, because instead of teamwork and work together and not against the whites, that is not what I see. We as a team who need to make a voice together, and instead we like divided ourselves to make more money to be allocated or something like that. When I say just watch over, oh my goodness, this is not, it's the other direction. It's go back to the old times rather than going into the future. So one of the things is that maybe this is for us, Desert Southwest. It's a very unique for me, like the conferences where East or West, where a lot of ethnics mingled. It's a different culture. It's totally different culture. So maybe we are the ones who make experiments among ourselves to work together. And so kind of jump out from your own cell and work together. Even though it's not easy for us to understand the other culture, but like at least we try to learn from each other and then hold hands together. I think it is a good place to me, because it's not a big conference compared to the others. And also number-wise, we are small in size. That's what I observe at this time.
I think being a team is really important. And I think Paul and others talk about the Christian unity. How can we reach out to the Christian unity, right? I think in order to be in order to reach out to Christian unity, I think it's important to understand our own sort of structural inequality. So we often in America talk about structural inequality of African Americans, and it's deeply embedded in American history. But I think Asians also have a structural inequality. And I think in order to understand each other, I think it's important to recognize those structural inequality. And those are the wounds we have. And in order to heal the wounds in our mind and brains, and for everyone, I think, I should pay attention to an African Americans, structural inequality from the history, but other ethnicity or races also, try to understand what kinds of, for instance, immigration histories Asians of different descents have, even in Koreans in the United States, there are huge merchants group in the United States, and also you have a very highly educated Koreans in the United States. So, for instance, as we have more Asian hate crimes these days, I think merchant groups are more likely to experience those hate crimes in the streets. So I urge audience to understand what kinds of immigration history they bring to the country, and how should you understand, as we always talk, throughout this conversation, not lumping Korean in just one bucket, but you also have to understand the immigration history and what kind of jobs they are in a daily life, because that really expose them in different kinds of discrimination. So I think, sort of cross-cultural understanding about structural issues, I think is really important to be united as under the God, and to be united in Christian way.
I appreciate that, what you're saying, brother, because I mean, education is an important part of it, self-education as well. I mean, I just recently learned about Angel Island, right? And how many Asian Americans came through Angel Island. There's this, we hear about Ellis Island and that story, but there's another side of it where people have experienced persecution and oppression for a very long time. Another thing that as a Christian, I'm very mindful of is just like you're saying, the differences. And I'm very mindful of my rhetoric when I'm talking about other people, because I've been in meetings where you were talking about racial matters, right? And I've seen this urge to move to, oh, well, and this happened in one of the meetings, actually, when someone said, well, we're all children of God. And when the conversation was getting a little contentious, oh, we're all children of God. And I agree with that statement, but I also consider the context in which that statement was made, in trying to say, well, we're all the same in some way. And as I think about it now, I'm saying, yeah, we're all children of God, but we don't have the same experiences. We don't have the same positions in our culture. We don't have the same journeys, and we have to, before we say something like that, before I say something like that as a pastor and a Christian, I have to step back a little bit and say, yes, it is true, we're all children of God, but at the same time, there's important differences in stories and histories that we just kind of have to be mindful of.
Yeah, you make a good point about not being aware of the history. Like, I didn't know about the Japanese internment camps in Arizona until I moved here a couple of years ago, where my best friend from high school, she's Japanese, and she still has nightmares about going back to those times whenever things get rough. And so there is a lack of history and that knowledge. And so I think you make a good point of not knowing that the background, the history of that immigrant knowledge, and that whole idea of like the model minority is such a harmful narrative and stereotype that's used to justify and to be used as a tool of supremacy, white supremacy, to pit groups against each other. That's so very harmful, and that's a narrative that we have to destroy. So thank you for bringing that awareness.
if I can share another story, and I'm sorry, I apologize, Paul, since I'm stealing from your job, but there was a comment about the painting behind me by Hiki, and he's a Chinese artist who does Christian paintings. And so this is a nativity. It reminds me of the story. Oh, and the comment that was made was, how do we create spaces that show a diversity to welcome people? And there was a time I was in a church and we were looking at Christmas bulletins, all the different bulletin covers. And there were, okay, I'm just gonna, the standard ones we see all the time here in the US. And then we got to, there were 2 bulletin covers of the Holy Family in kind of African-American art. And the person I was sitting with said, maybe they didn't realize that their internal monologue became external. And they said, I don't understand why everyone feels the need to paint Jesus in their own culture. And I responded, oh, you're referring to all the white Jesuses here, right? Because Jesus wasn't Roman. And it was an interesting conversation that didn't go too long, but it reminds me that that really being able to understand our faith from our own culture is something that everyone does to connect themselves to what is holy. And when we can make that connection and also then create space for others and their connections, and to be able to celebrate that diversity of perspective and that diversity of what's nice about activity are so many different art expressions of it. And the one thing out about the pandemic is when we were doing worship from home through the Advent season, gave me an opportunity to highlight some of our different nativities and the cultures that they came from. And when we can take opportunities throughout the year to just celebrate the variety of cultural influences that contribute to our churches, I think, and to Christianity, can be beautiful.
Thank you, Anthony, for getting to that question. I was afraid that we wouldn't be able to extend a Q&A. We know that you have questions for us. We regret that we don't have the time to answer them today, but I'm excited because that means we get to have more conversations after today, after this setting. I just want to do a quick plug. There is a document that is available for you to visit where you can see a curated list of resources regarding AAPI issues. I think some of the resources can offer answers or ideas, understandings that might address some of the questions you have, but I am grateful for your questions and I look forward to meeting with you in other settings. I want to turn over to Chris at this time.
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for attending this AAPI panel on how to be a better ally, sponsored by the DSC-Race Coalition. And special thank you again to all of our panelists for their vulnerability and their willingness to share their experience with all of us. And a huge thank you to Julie O'Neill and Paul Cho for moderating this discussion. And thank you for everyone that contributed your questions and helped guide that conversation. As Paul said, if you're interested in continuing this conversation, we'd encourage you to check out our AAPI reading list, which features 3 ways for you to engage this topic on your own, along with a reading and media list. You can check it out at dscrace.org under the 21-day challenge resources. Also, the DSC Race Coalition is proud to present one final thing this month that can help you to become a better ally. We've got a video featuring an interview with Bishop Bob Hoshibata as he shares more about his personal experience as an AAPI individual within the United Methodist Church throughout his long, influential career, all while trying food from 3 of the best, most delicious Asian restaurants in the Phoenix area. We've got a trailer that I think Julie is going to show right now.
I'm here as part of the DSC-Race Coalition on how to be a better ally. We are going to be having 3 meals from some of the best Asian restaurants here in the Valley, and we're going to have a great conversation on how we together can be better allies for the Asian American Pacific Islander community.
The interview itself clocks in at around 18 minutes, so perfect for a lunch break or right before you go to bed or whenever you consume internet media. And we would encourage you to check it out. The bishop says a lot of really insightful, important things that I think are good for everybody within our conference and in fact our denomination to hear. So we would encourage you to check that out. For more information on that, you can check out, again, dsc-race.org, and we'll post the video there as well as any of the widely available conference social media channels as well. All right, so everyone, thanks again for coming. Reverend Anthony Tang has offered to close us in prayer this evening as we get ready to go on with our night.
Gracious God, we thank you for having made each of us in your image. And as we journey through this life and this church together, we pray that you will continually draw us closer to you and closer to each other, that we may not marvel, but simply appreciate. To appreciate each other, to appreciate our differences, to appreciate our similarities, to appreciate who you have created us to be, that we may receive all of these blessings, that we may heal and participate in the healing of our world. So thank you. Thank you for this evening. And thank you for the great adventure that awaits us all. Amen.